them, Joel and Ben. So let's welcome Bill with a morning Wesleyan welcome. It's kind of golf clapping. Yeah.
Well, Russ just took my presentation, so I might as well sit down. Um, and I'm glad that Ben can join us for this presentation. And when I was thinking about a global perspective to ordination, I thought, well, let's have somebody that's doing global right now. So with the technology that we have that we can use, he's going to bring in a significant part of this practical piece of a global perspective on ordination. 50 years ago this year, I had an encounter with Jesus. I was 13 years old, and I grew up in Georgia, and it was at a camp meeting in South Georgia that happened. Taylor County Camp in South Georgia in Taylor County. The very next day, I was sitting on my bed in a dormitory room. I could take you to the spot even now where I powerfully sensed the Holy Spirit calling me to be a missionary. And I could never get away from that. And most of my teenage years, I was up and down spiritually, but every once in a while, about once a year it seemed, that the Holy Spirit would come to me and say, Bill, what are you going to do for me in Africa? And I came back to the Lord when I was 17 years old and began my journey with the Lord, heard clear preaching on what it meant to be entirely sanctified. What did that mean, and what piece did that play in my spiritual journey? I was not a Wesleyan. I grew up in the Methodist Church. My father was a United Methodist pastor in the South Georgia Conference. And so part of my heritage, though, was going to camp meetings, going to Indian Springs and Taylor County, and I did that almost every summer. And some of you may know the name John Church in the South. Clear preaching, and he helped me in my spiritual journey as a teenager. And then I went off to Bible college at a college in Kentucky called Kentucky Mountain Bible College. And it was there I met these people some people called Wesleyans. And I had kind of heard of them growing up in the Methodist Church, and I would hear about Union Camp in Georgia. And so I became good friends with some Wesleyans there. In fact, very good friends even today, Mark and Paul and Tom James. And so we graduated from there in 1975, and Mark, my good friend Mark, who we did summer ministries together for a couple of summers, Mark went to South Carolina to pastor. I went to Georgia to pastor in the Methodist Church. But about once a month, we would call each other and kind of encourage each other and kind of compare churches, how we were doing. And every once in a while, Mark would drop the kind of subtle suggestion, so when are you becoming a Wesleyan? And really, it was largely through their influence in my life that I stand here today. And made preparation, so we transferred into the Wesleyan Church. We were pastoring in the United Methodist Church, South Georgia Conference, and transferred into the Wesleyan Church, moved to South Carolina, began pastoring there. And then in 1982, my wife and I left with our two small children, and our youngest daughter, Christy, was born in Zambia. We left for Zambia in 1982, and for the next 15 years, we were mostly in Zambia. And for the next 15 of those 21 years, we were with Global Partners. And I can remember having conversations with Zambians in which I would walk away from the conversation and say, I don't know what he just said, even though we were speaking English. And that pursued a desire in me to go on for further studies. So I did not have any kind of graduate work at the time. Did a master's degree in missions and intercultural studies. A little bit later, did a PhD at Trinity and education, but with a strong focus in missions. And as I look back on it, every degree that I had done was either in missions or in education. And so it has shaped what I'm doing today. And so what I'm doing today is, after teaching at Kingswood for 13 years and making some great friends, my first winter there, I thought that I was not going to survive. It was so cold, and I had never seen more snow in my life, but did survive, and came to say, like the locals, well, it is what it is. No amount of complaining is going to change it, so you might as well live with it and cope with it. So did that for 13 years, and then last July, my wife and I began to feel a leading to come back to this part of the world, and I put a little post on my Facebook page to say that that we were leaving Kingswood, and it was the first time in 40 years that I did not know what I was going to. I received almost within the hour, I received a response back from Dennis Jackson. And he said, well, let's talk. And so we began to talk about a new position that was being established in Global Partners called what came to be called the Global Leadership Catalyst Director, which is giving direction to an initiative within Global Partners to see pastors ordained globally. And so that's what I'm doing now, focusing on that initiative within Global Partners. And would you write down the numbers 84 and 83? 84 and 83. 84 actually is 83.6. That's the number of lead pastors here in North America that are ordained. 83.6, that comes from Rod McClung. And 83% is the percentage of churches that we have around the world that are under the care of GP, that are pastored by untrained pastors. 84 and 80. Now, those have no connection in terms of statistics, but it is an interesting numbers to think about, 84 and 83%. As we move through our time this morning, I'd like for us to be thinking about this question that I included in the handout. And the question is this: when we review our theology and when we revisit our history, and then we see today the options and the value that is placed on an educated clergy, and then we recognize the realities of the global Wesleyan church, that ought to cause us to pause and think about, to ask some good questions, or to think about these big ideas related to a global perspective of helping us in North America think about ordination. So that's the focus that I want to bring to this symposium this morning, is to think about how should we think about ordination, we in North America, how should we come at it, also including not just our theology and not just our history and not just our present practices, but also how should we think about ordination from a global perspective. And so just as a way of introduction this morning, so we're hearing about these historical perspectives, and we're going to hear from a theological perspective from John later today. And so when I think about those perspectives, there's another perspective that I think we need to include given the realities of the world that we live in today, and that is the global perspective, that our neighbors and our communities and our workmates sometimes and our schoolmates of our children, they're different ethnically and culturally and linguistically from us many times, and we need to learn how to live in that world. That world is coming to us, and we're doing the right thing at this conference, at this symposium today, and that is thinking about how an intentional, relational, holistic, multiplying, lifelong approach to raising up ordained and appropriately credentialed ministers influences us to properly think about and interact locally as well as globally. That world has come to us. It keeps coming to us. I am presently living in Metro Atlanta, in the area of Metro Atlanta. And the 2016 census recently came out to say that if you look at the population of Atlanta, that's only about 500,000 people. But if you add Metro Atlanta, it kicks it up to about 5.7 million people. And so when you begin to look at the realities of that world keeps coming. Metro Atlanta was the fourth largest increase in the United States in terms of people moving to that area of the country. That population is not going to stop coming to us. And I want to remind us that our calling is to that world. Our calling is to Jesus to go to that world. And so I want to take as a foundation for a global perspective to ordination John Wesley's famous four-word expression, "The world is my parish." Actually, he wrote those words on June 11, 1739, almost 278 years ago now. in which he said, I look upon all the world as my parish. And Wesleyans have used these words to foster a missional clarity, something to help us hone in on what we are about, what we should be about, to our ministries, the ministry activities since our beginning. It's in our DNA to think about it this way, but sometimes the identification and thus the practice on our DNA strand has been difficult to see and value. It's sort of like a dormant skill that's just beginning to see. They see something in you and in us, and it's just beginning to come out. And so what I want to think about this morning is in North America, these perspectives, these considerations we bring to the table when we think about ordination. And so the first one of those is ordination education. If you look at the visual in your handout, for some reason I could not open my computer this morning, but if you look at the visual in the handout, and as we reflect on that visual, you can notice at least a couple of things. We place high value on an educated clergy. Whatever level of education we define that as, we place a high value on an educated clergy. Whether this education and learning are obtained through an undergraduate, through graduate, through training programs, through competency-based options, or some other alternative coursework pathway. We expect, don't we, from our pastors, from an educational perspective, that our pastors and those giving ordained leadership have adequate knowledge, they possess a holy character, and they develop practical skills for the ministry in which she or he will be involved. How well I remember a few years ago at Kingswood when Dave Smith was at that time our academic dean. He took us through a rigorous process of identifying what are the competencies that we want to see in a person when they walk across the platform and receive a Kingswood diploma, and we stamp our seal of approval on their lives. What is it that we want to see in them? At least they've reached an adequate or a common point of accomplishment. And that was a rigorous process, but what did we want them to know? What did we want them to be? And what did we want them to be able to do? And so Kingswood, like all of our schools, we place a lot of money into that process as well. And so we value that. And also we value an educated clergy, but we also value options. And think about the reflections in our North American culture that we value options. You just look at the kind of vehicle that you're driving, the options that they have on the car. You can pay a little money or you can pay a lot of money for just the options that you get on a car. North American Wesleyans, they love their cars, but they also love their educational options. And if you look at that visual, we have two major pathways to ministry. We have a preferred standard that they go through one of our schools, and they go through Wesley Seminary or one of our approved seminaries, as well as alternative pathways to ministerial education and training. And if you were to analyze that visual, you would discover that there are over 20 well-marked pathways that provide to the minister in training the way to formal education that's required to become an ordained minister in the North American General Conference of the Wesleyan Church. It seems quite feasible to conclude that a North American ordained ministry traveling on one or a combination of these pathways should be able to finish the academic requirements for ordination in a relatively short period of time, all things being equal. Most of us in this room did exactly that. If we're ordained in this room, we did that, one of those pathways we traveled on. I was pursuing ordination in the United Methodist Church. I had graduated from a Bible college, and when I joined the Wesleyan Church, They took all of that into account, and they said, okay, this is a little pathway that you have to do. So I went to Southern, and I took history and discipline of the Wesleyan Church and polity of the Wesleyan Church. I pastored for a year in the district, and then I was ordained. So I had met, and apparently there were other qualifications that they saw in my life and well. So thank the Lord for the places where effective training is happening around the world. For most of the Wesleyan Church outside North America, however, this is not the case. And that's where 83% is a significant number for, it ought to be a significant number for all Wesleyans around the world, and particularly in North America because we're such a sending agency. Approximately 80 or 83% of global churches are pastored by pastors who are not ordained. The Jesus film has created the biggest problem for the Wesleyan Church we've ever had. And that is we have had hundreds of thousands of converts, hundreds of churches started, and our educational institutions haven't been able to keep up in producing men and women prepared for the ministry. And when we look at the realities of the world around us in terms of the pathways that they have, those pathways are fraught with difficult issues. And I wrote down just a few of them. A very different educational pathway exists for them, as indicated by, we have over 20 options here in North America. Sometimes it's a blessing to have 3 or 4 in one place, in an outside North America. Religious, political, social, and or other contextual issues block the path for the potential ministerial student. When it is available, it's often too costly for the student who is an older, mature student with the family and work responsibilities. Family roots go deep, and many times families are not easily displaced in order to go into a residential setting for studies. Displacement can sometimes mean having to travel long distances, costing thousands of miles, and leaving one's cultural group to go and study. That even is the case for North Americans. If you go up to Canada, for example, and you're from the South, you have culture shock, big time. And too often, a student outside North America, as well as in North America, will start on the path of ministerial training only to drop away because of one or more of these realities. As we consider the world as our parish, we're living out what we have always been. And that is, we have always, from Wesley himself on up to us, we have seen that the world is our parish. It's our parish. And to try to pastor our parish well, we have to think like missionaries and think in those kinds of terms. So much of our international ministerial family sees the value that North America places on a quality ministerial education and training experience, and they want the same thing. I've got in my emails about 6 people from around the world that are making application to go to Wesley Seminary, but they need funding. So they see the quality of what's happening, and now they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to get in that pathway. However, most of our global family today also looks across an educational chasm that restricts them from obtaining necessary training for ministry. They are influenced by a context that shackles their pursuit of those studies. And I wanted to take us to a place, and so we're going to Singapore. Ben, are you there?
Yes, sir. I'm here, Bill.
Great.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Can we? Okay, there you are. Good to see you. So Ben is he's our Asia area director, and he's also a graduate of Wesley Seminary. I think he went to school with Chris, and so the person I'm probably working with the closest these days in my new role is Ben, because some very exciting things are happening in the area of the world where he is giving leadership to. And he may touch on that. But Ben, so it's your turn now.
Well, thanks, Bill. And it's definitely an honor to be in this room today with colleagues I know a lot of people that I've had as professors through the years are here, so I'll admit I'm a little intimidated by getting to be with this group. But really appreciate, Bill, you inviting me into this opportunity, because this is something that I'm deeply passionate about. Bill has presented the why of why we need to engage globally when it comes to ordination. The main thing I want to talk about today is the how. And when we think about the vastness of the need, it can just seem overwhelming. Bill's stat that he gave, 83% globally are not ordained. That's 83% of the majority of our churches. We've got about 1,600 churches in the United States, 3,200 outside the United States. And that's only in the places where we're actively reaching. In the context of Asia, we have over 4 billion people on our continent. 93% claim no Christian affiliation at all. And so the vast majority of the world's non-Christian people are here. And it can seem like just this insurmountable gap of what efforts can we do to see the transformation that we want to see. But I'm convinced that where it begins a lot of times, and where it began biblically, is that when God wanted to make a difference in a place, he started by calling a leader. And we see that with our Wesleyan movement, what God can do that starts in the heart of a leader and then quickly spreads and more leaders get involved. So I'm not only convinced that we need to, I'm convinced that we can serve as catalysts to increase the ministerial training capacity of the global church. And before we jump into some specific case studies from Asia Pacific about how we can serve as catalysts, I want to put a few ordination questions that may have some bearing in other places globally, but are particularly true in Asia Pacific area. First is, who has legitimate authority? I had the opportunity to read John Drew's paper that's being presented later today, and he linked authority as one of the most central pieces of the ordination ritual. Globally, that's very true, and it's an important question for us to answer. When we're working in a global context, we want to be able to vouch to our church that certain people have been screened and that they're orthodox. But also culturally, having legitimate authority is very important. I was in Starbucks today, and I'm amazed by the number of coffee masters. Those are the ones that wear black aprons that have completed the Starbucks coffee training. So because when a credentialing is put out there, people want to attain to it. Another way we see that is that people not in academic professions will print their degrees on their business card. So whether you're a business person or a doctor, you'll print where you received your credentials to be able to do your profession. And another important reality that we have to answer this question in Asia, who has legitimate authority, is that we need to combat the spread of heresy. There are a lot of people that have risen up claiming some authority, but they're not rooted in the tradition and orthodoxy of the church. Another critical question we need to answer is the gospel foreign or for me? In Thailand and Cambodia, these are countries that have had a missionary presence for well over 100 years with less than 1% Christian at present. And one of the things we realized in working there is too often we have imposed Western models, and that's also reflected in the way that we train leaders. So the way that we contextualize the gospel when we move into a new place often begins with our views on ordination and how we qualify people for ordination. Another question, are we willing to multiply? What we wrestle here with in Asia at times is a patriarchal leadership style that has some blessings with it, but can also have a tendency to want to centralize and hold on to power. And so sometimes our existing leaders can feel threatened when we begin the conversation of how do we make ordination more available, because there's a fear that if we bring more people into ordained ministry that we lessen their power. Another area where we specifically need to ask this question, are we willing to multiply, relates to our view on ordaining women. One of the marks of the Wesleyan movement has been the high view that we give toward women in ministry. In some more patriarchal cultures, it feels like that's something that we're still fighting for, even among people that have been part of the Wesleyan Church for a while. Another question is, are quality resources available? I remember one time in Mongolia, I was there with Jen and Corey Ellison, who are there in the room today. We got a tour of the one seminary's library for the country of Mongolia. And it was amazing the lack of resources that were there. In this one theological library, the very limited number of resources that were available in Mongolian that could be used for theological education. But beyond just having quality resources available, another key question is the pathway clear? There are places where there have been a lot of conferences, there have been some best-selling books that have been translated into local languages. And so people have those kinds of resources, but there's not a clear pathway of how do these all integrate into preparing a leader for service in the church. So that's one of the main pieces of work that's still to be done, is in clarifying pathways for ordination. So 2 big thoughts. First is that North American church leaders can serve as catalysts to increase the training capacity of the global church. And then the second thought is that how North Americans can meaningfully engage will vary based on the maturity of host country training solutions. So I want us to look at 3 case studies, early, intermediate, and advanced in their maturity as far as the training solution that's available in the host country and how that influences the way we would engage. First place is China, and this is a place that is early for us. A couple of background facts about China. Church growth has been explosive. 4 million known Christians, 1 million Protestant, 3 million Catholic in 1949, when Mao took over and kicked out foreign missionaries. Today that's grown to 60 to 120 million. And that's obviously a pretty wide rounding error there, a wide estimate range. But the reason for that is that we just don't know exactly, because a lot of the largest movements in China are underground. It's difficult for churches to affiliate with denominational systems outside China. China in recent years has not been so much anti-God as they have been anti-foreign domination. And denominational systems with headquarters outside of China are perceived as a threat to the government. Smaller registered church, there is a registered church and an underground church, the registered church being controlled by the Chinese government. And they have some seminaries. The larger house church movement, which is where the vast majority of Christians are, one of their main techniques is to have a 1-year post-high school training that's somewhere at an undisclosed location in the country. Now, if we talk about as is, what is the condition at present that necessitates further training and in our case, calls for us to engage. Some of the facts about China that are currently true. The current training levels are sufficient for rural environments, but not for today's urban reality. So if you think about 1 year post-high school education, when you're working in a farming community, that may be sufficient. But China, over the last century, has experienced the most rapid urbanization of any country in history. And a lot of times, house church educated pastors aren't as equipped to be relevant in an urban reality. Second thing is we've got an unique combination of secrecy and suspicion that's arisen from the persecution in China, combined with a lack of denominational structure, and it's leading to a breeding ground for heresy. And so that is something that, as we think about what credentialing can offer, it can be a safeguard against heresy. Third reality, Chinese culture values official credentialing even more than we do in the West. We value an ordained clergy. Chinese culture looks for official recognition for a lot of things that they do. So here's what could be if we engage, and these are specific opportunities that we could engage in an early context like China. PhD educators can teach in registered church seminaries. A lot of times we can get an invitation. I heard of a Assemblies of God Old Testament professor that was invited to teach in their top seminary, and that results in a trickle-down effect. If we can get high-quality content in through the registered route, a lot of times it'll influence the larger house church movement. Doctoral and master's level trained educators can help us develop a customized program for use within the house church movement. We're looking at, in addition to the registered church track, the underground or house church track, where we can develop some systematic ordination training. And as part of that, in addition to the educators, we need an ordination track architect, someone that can help us develop a good housekeeping seal of approval type certification that we're able to give to people that would complete a training through the Wesleyan Church. It's interesting that this is the reverse approach in some ways to our paradigm for missions. A lot of times we think of going into a fully unreached people and establishing relationships, winning first followers, and then eventually getting to the point of developing leaders. Where China is, while we have an opportunity to develop leaders that can in turn lead to a multiplying movement of churches. Second example is looking at an intermediate context. So this is intermediate in the sense that we already have a fair amount of thinking in place as to what it could be. This would be Cambodia would be an example. We've had limited gospel penetration, possibly resulting from insufficient contextualization. Residential training programs that we've imported necessitate participants to leave their village, occupation, and relational context. And oftentimes, either they don't return, they fail out, they have problems with completion, or they become otherwise irrelevant to their village. And then Western literate forms and methodologies do not translate to people from oral cultures. So it's oftentimes not that people in Cambodia can't read, but it's not the way that they learn anything else of value in their culture. They prefer an oral learning style. So as far as the could be of Cambodia, what could be as we engage, we're looking at developing a video-based curriculum, intensives, and mentoring programs that all play a role in developing the future leaders of the movement. And North Americans can contribute in some following specialty areas: curriculum development, video production, and website design. So it looks a little bit different than what our engagement could be in an early phase, but each phase requires a little bit different skill set for our engagement. The last area to look at is an advanced field, Papua New Guinea being an example of that. Interior tribes in Papua New Guinea were first discovered in the 1930s. So discovered by Westerners, that is, flying over in planes. So you could say that Papua New Guinea really is the uttermost parts of the earth. Wesleyan missionaries arrived in 1961, and today we have over 5,000 members in 100 local churches. And we have a Wesleyan Bible College that offers a 3-year certificate level training program to ordination. So in a lot of ways, Papua New Guinea is a place where theological education is going well. However, they're facing certain challenges. In their Bible school, they have 2 primary teachers, both who have Bachelor of Theology degrees. So anchor theologians and educators are needed. And one of the other realities of Papua New Guinea is that while many claim to be Christian, over 90%, I believe, it's a wide but shallow Christianity. I was there recently and it's election time, and our national leader announced that he didn't want to see any dead bodies as a result of the election. So while many claim to be Christian, tribal feuds a lot of times trump their Christianity, and we have a really deep need for the truth to penetrate people's lives in more significant ways. And lay people, particularly women, again, a bit of a cultural barrier, lack access to basic Bible training. So there could be how we could respond. We need facilitative academic leaders that consult on developing courses of study in the Bible school. One of the things they've asked for is that we would send someone to be their principal. We're reluctant to do that because of the way that they've developed as a church. We want to encourage national leadership, but I think at the core, what they're really saying is that they just want help. They want to benefit from people who are further down the road and thinking through what courses prepare future ministers and helping them to develop that. We also can use educators there, and we don't need educators necessarily to commit for a full year. We can use people that teach modular courses, and master's or doctorate level degrees are sufficient for that. We also need a discipleship architect that could develop a model for making basic training broadly available. And I know that our primary focus here is on the ordination level of training and discipleship. But one of the identified needs in Papua New Guinea is we need to pour some more cement around the base. So while our main focus today is ordination, I don't want to lose sight of that need that we have. That's a connected need of making just basic training more broadly available. So in summary, North American church leaders can serve as catalysts. It's definitely possible. And the how needs to be contextualized based on where we are in the country. So that's just a brief snapshot of a few places that we are in Asia Pacific and how this can apply as we think about ordination globally. I'll turn it back over to Bill for some wrap-up thoughts and discussion.
Well, thank you, Ben, and be sure to stay on the line. We're going to have a conversation, I think, afterwards when both of us are finished. I told you a bit of my story early on. I left out the most significant part in terms of our context this morning, and that was my ordination in 1979. J.D. Abbott was the residing general superintendent, and I sat under his preaching, and he had responsibility for ordaining, and I was the last I was the last person to be ordained by him in what was in the southern area. And so I will always have that memory in it, and the very sacred moment it was for me as a means of grace and other things as well. So what is a global perspective to ordination? I want to suggest, and we're going to talk about that in our conversation time, I want to suggest that a starting point is that we regularly think like missionaries. We get into the habit of thinking like missionaries. Even to our approach of ordination, our valuing of history, our valuing of theology, our practice of ministry, we approach that with the lens of a missionary as we think about those issues. And so with that, I want to share this last word of an African proverb which says, if you want to go farther, go alone. Or if you want to go faster, go alone. If you want to go farther, go with others. And so the Global Wesleyan Church in many cases looks to the North American church because of its growth, because of its resources, because of you. And they and many times they just sit back and they say, wow, this is what the North American church can help us. And so where did Russ go? We'll take it to the next step then.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We will do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll break into our groups. Just a couple